Hello, all. I hope that you are logging into this wonderful Meet the Innovators session. Well, thank you so much for joining our Meet the Innovators session from the EIT Health Summit Series of 2020, brought to you live via online, as many things in 2020 have been. My name is Joy. I am the head of the accelerator, and I'm being joined today by Jack, CEO and co-founder of Ochre Bio. Ochre Bio has been working with EIT Health through its Gold Track program, and I'm very happy to have them here to talk a little bit about what Ochre Bio exactly does, hopefully some recent successes that have happened for Ochre Bio, but also to get a little spotlight on their business models related to the Meet the Innovators session. So of course, like all of our Meet the Innovators session, I encourage you to ask questions, to think of questions as Jack is presenting. You can use the Zoom function at the bottom to type in any of your questions, and I will be reviewing them and asking them to Jack once his presentation is over. Without further ado, Jack, we're really looking forward to hearing a little bit more about Ochre Bio.
Thanks, Joy. Looking forward to the discussion as well. So hello, everyone. I'm going to try and get my clicker works. Okay, excellent. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our business today, and I'll introduce you to Ochre Bio and what we do, and then I'll give you a few of the lessons we've learned as we've gone about getting up and running and building out our team, and ultimately looking towards getting medicines towards patients, which is our ultimate goal. So on that note, to maybe introduce you to the business of Ochre Bio in brief, we develop medicines that we hope will serve patients with chronic liver and cardiometabolic diseases. These are some of the most challenging diseases of our time, killing up to four out of every 10 people. And it's a big, big, ambitious goal we have. But in order to get there, we have to think about how do we reframe these complex, multifactorial diseases into indications that we could initially tackle, and we knew were attractable to a small business like Ochre Bio. So the first focus we have as a business is to try and salvage, focus on the transplant space, where these same diseases pose a significant challenge to transplant centers. So let me introduce you to one of our colleagues here in Oxford, Hussein, and in his left hand there, or right hand, if I turn sideways, is a perfusion device that is keeping a donor liver alive inside of that little translucent box there. And the reason it's keeping it alive is that surgeons need to assess whether livers can be used for transplant, because many donor livers that actually come into transplant centers have too much fat on them and are too unhealthy to be used, which is a problem a lot of people don't know plagues the transplant space. And what we're doing as a business is developing medicines to actually treat these suboptimal donor livers, to make them available for transplant and ultimately improve outcomes on the other side for patients who receive them. And we do this, and we identify medicines using a combination of new technologies, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. But one of the benefits of working in the transplant space is that a lot of the preclinical work we do are on livers that have been rejected for transplant. So we work primarily in human tissue and minimize animal studies as we go through our development process. So first indication is transplant, broader vision is chronic liver disease and metabolic health. And let me tell you a little bit about the technologies we use to enable our therapeutic development. So I want to also reintroduce Ochre now as a tech bio company. What I've done there is essentially flip biotech on its head, because we do use a lot of new age genomic advanced sequencing technologies to try and uncover insights into challenging diseases and use that to inform our therapeutic development, which is primarily driven by technology. So I like to incorporate that into how we do things. And ultimately, what we've termed our approach to identifying new therapeutic targets as deep phenotyping. And without going into too much detail, I'll briefly explain to you how we do that. So this is one of the big projects we're running this year, is a study on 1,000 livers across the fatty liver disease spectrum. And these are 2 samples of 2 different liver tissues that we've taken and we've imaged. And we've used imaging AI to identify regions within the tissue that are particularly diseased or are showing the earlier signs of inflammation. Those are highlighted in blue. And what we do then is we take cells from those areas and sequence in those particular regions to ask the question, what is fundamentally different about this piece of tissue that's starting to get disease against a healthier piece of tissue next to it? And what is the first inklings of disease? And how can we identify where to appropriately intervene to best therapeutically treat this disease? And these are clues that we build up as we match these outcomes, these insights we develop against patient outcomes and so forth across 1,000 tissues, across 1,000 patients essentially, to try and figure out how to make the best medicines for these patients. So that's a little bit into the technology. Flicker. And now just in brief to summarize what I've just said. So fundamentally, Ochre Bio is a medicines company. We want to take therapies to clinic, both initially in transplant as a tractable disease, but ultimately for much larger, broader indications like NASH, NAFLD, cardiometabolic health. We have a platform element to how we uncover novel targets, how we pick how we want to intervene in these disease processes. And we do that using a number of new technologies that I've outlined previously. And ultimately, our strategy as a business is to go to the clinic. We don't want to trade on targets with large pharma. We want to ultimately make medicines that improve patient lives. And we may, along that way, find ways to co-develop other insights that fall out of our discovery programs. But ultimately, we are a medicines business. So with that said, I'm going to give you a little bit of a few of the lessons we learned as we went through our journey. And one of them is actually a personal lesson, maybe before even all this Ochre Bio started. It was two quotes that I heard. One, when finishing up university and heading out into the world of industry, one of my professors at the time told me, "Jack, don't worry about it. We've taught you all the hard stuff, the engineering, the hard sciences, all this business stuff you're going to go and do. That's the easy stuff." Then I moved to the States and spent 5 or 6 years working with life sciences and technology companies to try and help them get started. And one of the lectures I attended over there was from a professor at Stanford who said, "Look, the business of starting science and technology companies is not easy and requires careful diligence, planning, etc." And I think that has definitely been one of the core tenets of our development as a business, is thinking deeply about how we do things. And it's not necessarily as easy as some might think. So one of the first lessons we learned as we got out the gates at the beginning of our journey was how to survive what's typically called the valley of death for early stage life sciences companies. And this is the point in a life sciences company's journey where they don't have any data, so they can't prove their scientific hypothesis to investors or to grantors or so forth. And because they can't do that, they can't get any money, which they would ultimately use to develop the data, which will prove out their hypothesis. And this is often a challenge for very early stage companies. There's a number of ways that companies can think about de-risking their investment proposal for life sciences investors or grantors. Ultimately, we primarily focused on the venture capital route, but there's a lot of great supports in Europe, particularly for early stage companies. So when one wants to try and attract capital from typical life sciences or biotech investor, there's a few different things that are very important. I think one is establishing credibility as a business, and there's a number of ways you can do that. One is by building a very strong advisory board, and that was something EIT Health really helped us to do through the likes of Don Bell, who was a CSO of Novartis Canada and was a great help to us as we got started as a business. The other is by attaching themselves to very well-known accelerator programs to help build the brand and build the credibility of the business in the earliest days. And we did that by participating in both EIT's Gold Track, Entrepreneur First, and Y Combinator, all simultaneously. Probably debatable whether that was the best move, but it did help to attract a lot of investor attention across different spectrums of the investment landscape, which ultimately helped us drive up competitive dynamics for our initial fundraising deal and helped us get things off the ground. But one of the other, I think, really important things we did, which if I get my clicker working, I'll show you, is about getting validation from the market. So we did initial deals with life sciences, with large pharma, around R&D collaborations. These are service-based contracts. They're not necessarily a thing you want to get into the habit of doing if you're a medicines company, but it enabled us to leverage the technology platform we were building to partner up and get paid by a large pharmaceutical company, which we could then take to our investors and show market viability of our science, which really got investors excited. And it also brought in a little bit of money. What it really did from a strategy perspective, as we thought about architecting this deal, was it allowed us to actually develop relationships with key influencers in industry who could ultimately lead to much larger co-shared value creation deals, such as the ones you read about in the news, larger biobucks deals. So although it was an initial value or important validation point for us as a business, it may ultimately help, I should say, us lead to much larger biobucks deals, which is the goal of Ochre Bio. So one of the other lessons we learned as we went along our journey is that if you're a medicines company, you should invest in your medicines, not necessarily your platform. And this is we've spoken to a lot of investors and a lot of similar founders who are in this tech bio intersection. And something I think the earlier versions of this industry did was particularly double down their investment in the platform element of their business, where they built a very sophisticated computational platform that was really focused on uncovering novel biological insights. But then as they went to their later stages of funding, they traversed the technology investor to the biotech investor side of the fence. The biotech investor just wants to understand, what's your lead asset? How far is it in its development process? What's the clinical roadmap look like? And doesn't necessarily care that much about your platform, because really you haven't necessarily validated your platform until you put one of the lead candidates on your platform into a patient and shown that it actually works. So so that's just something to bear in mind, is that as we think about our development, we are really doubling down on investing in the medicines that we create rather than the platform itself. So lesson number 3 is about finding the right investors for the right round of funding. And this quote I thought was quite funny from an investor I was trying to pitch in Boston at an event one time, who told me, "I only invest in gray furry things, so you can part ways with me now." Now what he meant by that was, I only invest in people with gray hair and who have mice data. And because we were right at the beginning of the journey and my hair hasn't fallen out yet, or gone gray, thankfully, we didn't have either of those things. So this is it was just an interesting telltale point of the differences between technology investors and more traditional life sciences investors, who both serve really important purposes within the growth of a tech bio company, and can bring really different skills and add a lot of value in different ways. But they have a very different mindset for how they think about things. And it's primarily driven by the legacy of and some of the history and the business model of these two groups. The first thing, a few points that I just want to make on this, and the first one is about their approach to management. And I've metaphorically drafted this through the lens of how they dress, which is probably an unfair thing to do, but typically in California, probably because of the good weather, investors there are oftentimes shorts and flip-flops type people. And then if you go to the East Coast, where a lot of a lot of the original, or what's sometimes termed the epicenter of biotech investing in Boston, much more common to see guys in the Patagonia vests and shirts, which is a much slicker outfit, one might argue. And what I mean by saying that is that the investors who come from more traditional biotech investing space oftentimes have a much more heavy-handed approach to management of their portfolios. And that often means they'll implement management teams from their own networks. They're very fond of venture creation versus investing in startups from the wild, as they say. And so on and so forth. Whereas technology investors are big believers in founder first, enabling and empowering the founder to run the business. And there are benefits and disadvantages to both of these things. The second point is really sticking to the benefits of these groups, where they really understand clinical development and regulatory strategies, and they can add a tremendous amount of value for us as we look towards our clinical development over the next year or so, next couple of years, I should say. But equally, they are sometimes, it can be damaging to culture, and there's other considerations to make when you cross that threshold. The other one that's a danger with technology investors is, because they don't necessarily have the biological background, they can't always diligence your science well enough. So they might push you to do deals probably too early in the development of a program in order to, as a proxy for biological diligence. And that can sacrifice the long-term value of the business, and is something that you need to be careful of as how you think about and architect those deals. And I can speak to that later if people are interested about the deal we did and how we thought about it. But something else that's important, if you're chartering a path to IPO, you really need to have biotech people by your side, because you're going to be talking to late stage financiers who don't necessarily trust the traditional technology investors. And then last thing I think is an interesting point is around these there is more crossover funds coming into the market, which is great to see, but the technology investors typically look at a business like ours through the lens of platform, through the lens of how many indications can you serve, how broad a portfolio can you build with your technological innovation, whereas a biotech investor looks at the business through the lens of your lead asset. What's the medicine you've taken the furthest? How long is that going to take to get to market? What's the clinical development program and the regulatory risk? And there's a calculated or NPV value essentially assigned to the business via that. I think neither one is quite right. I think fundamentally you need to address both of those challenges, but fundamentally you need to add value or assign value to both the platform and the lead asset, because this new wave of technology is enabling in a way that hasn't been done before multiple asset companies. And anyway, I can speak to that in more detail. I just think it's an interesting question that has not yet been solved. So last thing I want to say before I wrap up is about Europe, because we are at the EIT Health Conference today. And this quote I'm showing on top of the screen is an adaptation of a quote that was originally stated, "Software is eating the world," made by a guy called Mark Andreessen back in the early 2000s when the Googles, the Facebooks, the Stripes were blowing up and becoming the technology megaliths that we see today. And what the point was making that, and I guess it was interesting at the time, where in Silicon Valley, there was a really high concentration of amazing technological breakthroughs, but equally strong technology company leadership, strong executive leadership within that very small vicinity. That Europe just never had, didn't really ever catch up to, I would argue, and maybe it's unfair, but didn't really have the same success that Silicon Valley did. The same person, Mark Andreessen, has readapted that quote to say bio is eating the world in the 2020s, and this decade is all about bio and the innovations that's coming out of the biological sphere. And I would absolutely echo that, and I think it's very exciting for anyone to be in this field, and I'm blessed to be so. But what I think is different about in the context of Europe is that now Europe actually has a real edge, both in terms of the amazing science universities and institutes that come out of Europe that do so well from the public funding in Europe. You can name, you know what I'm talking about. And then, but equally, and I would argue maybe more importantly, is the executive leadership that's coming out of the likes of Novartis and Novo Nordisk, and these places that are oftentimes seen as CEO training grounds. And I think those are the people that can help take these startup companies to the next level. I think EIT has an important role to play in bridging the gap between early stage fledgling businesses and real industry leaders who can help grow and scale those businesses into the large economy driving businesses that we see today. So yeah, it's an exciting era for healthcare, and it's an exciting era for Europe. So happy to take any questions and chat in more detail.
Thank you so much, Jack. I forgot to give you enough time to mention that.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I am a big believer in European ecosystem and driving and supporting the entrepreneurial networks within Europe. So please do connect with me on the social medias and follow Ochre Bio. We want to continue to tell our story. And yeah, really excited to chat.
Thanks so much. And dear attendees, both joining us online and will be later watching the recording, Jack does really mean this. He's a great conversationalist to give you guys some insights about Ochre, but also, a bit from his personal experience. So thanks so much, and feel free to connect there. Like Jack just mentioned, feel free to ask any questions within the Q&A. We already have a few questions lined up, of course. But of course, I just wanted to wrap up in saying that it would be my pleasure if in 10 years we're talking about, the Googles, the Facebooks, and then the Ochre Bios and other companies coming out of EIT Health. So we're leaving it up to you, Jack.
The pressure is on. The pressure is on. Well, I'm optimistic. I guess that's my job, though.
Of course. Specifically regarding the novel aspects of your technology, I think whenever anyone has a novel technology in healthcare is always said to be a little bit more traditional. How have you gone about, approaching your operations and approaching investors, knowing that you have a novel technology, and you actually even have two products, basically? You have your medicines offering and you have your platform offering. So how are you able to just distinguish that?
Yeah, I guess healthcare has there's a lot of good reasons to be skeptical. I think in biology is one of those things where you can never really predict what's going to happen until you put it into an assay or into a patient ultimately. But so I guess one thing we've been very careful to, as we've told our story and as we've begun to get to know these types of folks, is to be quite humble and to be quite honest about this is our approach and why we believe it's different. But until we have strong data to validate the medicines we're developing, we don't tend to shout and roar about their progress until we have really data-driven insights. And that's like our CSO, who joined for one of the earlier talks, is very strong evidence-based training, and he has to sometimes caution me with my language because I'm a little bit more optimistic than he is, but just being very brutally honest about what the evidence is saying about our discoveries to date. But also equally, trying to tell the story of this is a new era of biological discovery, where there are new and massive advances being made in sequencing and genomics to try and tease apart how disease actually works. And by doing that at scale, we do believe we will get better medicines, but we won't say that until we actually have them. So yeah, I think it's a balance between confidently telling your story, but being humble enough to know that it's there's no silver bullet in biology, and we just have to wait and see how our initial studies go.
Do you change your approach to pitching your company, Ochre, for the West Coast investors and for the European investors? In your previous slides, you mentioned a little bit of background about what the investors are looking for, and how some of them are more looking into the quick action technology platform play, and others, like the biotech investors, are drilling down into clinical regulation. I'd love to give you the opportunity to expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Joy. So I guess maybe to frame that, so I do talk to a lot of other founders who are in this kind of intersection of technology and biotech. And something I've heard a lot of people say is that they will have, not a lot of people, but a couple of times I've heard people say they've got a technology investor deck and a biotechnology investor deck. And we have really strongly tried to avoid having to dilute our story. Number one, because I'm not intelligent enough to remember two different stories. But number two, because it just makes things very clear and consistent that we are a medicines company, but we have a technology-enabled approach to get to those medicines. So we don't necessarily have two different distinct stories. We just have a very long pitch deck. and in that pitch deck, we do try and spell out, both to appeal to both parties, to a traditional biotech investor, what our lead candidate is, what the clinical development timelines look like, what the costs are associated with that in a very granular detail. But equally, on the technology side, we have a detailed, we're building, I should say, a detailed deck to explain the computational element, to explain the data sets we're building, and why we have fundamental conviction that they will lead to new biological discoveries that will fuel new therapeutic development. So I think both elements are really core to who we are as a business, and we try to tell both of those parts of the story very clearly. But I think people zoom in on different things, and that's the nature of the different groups we talk to.
We have a question here surrounding the business model and how you have approached things now since the ongoing pandemic. Have you shifted in any way the business model or the story a little bit to emphasize specific points because of feedback you've received from the investors or the community, and now in this pandemic time?
I think, interestingly, we started our fundraise right on the day San Francisco went into lockdown. We were starting our fundraise in San Francisco. So there's this moment of chaos, and it's all going to go to south. We worked so hard on this. And then, very interestingly, I don't think it hurt us that much. I think we raised all our fundraise over Zoom, which was, I think, a kind of a first for a lot of companies at the time. And what was interesting is that because a lot of our work is computational, so a lot of our technology-based platform is sequencing driven and is analytics driven, we were able to make a lot of progress on that for the first few months of severe lockdown, while we actually got the wet lab stood up, and while we didn't have a lot of work going on in the wet lab. And then as the restrictions began to loosen, we could really make a lot of headway on our wet lab side as well, and have team in the lab, which is great. So I think it actually worked out quite well for us as we got up and running, and we weren't slowed down too much. Now, it did make things a little bit more expensive, shipping and such, but nothing that was insurmountable.
It sounded like almost that it has helped you really focus in on one particular element, like setting up the wet lab and also working on the computational stuff. So that's incredible.
And it forced us to think about how we could de-risk it going forward, because we have had some slowdowns on our clinical work or on our preclinical work with transplant centers just because they've been shut down. So we've looked to Asia to set up bases in other parts of the world where there has been less of a COVID standstill. So it's forced us to get, I guess, what's the word? Creative, is that the word? Forced to be adaptable, which is always good for early stage businesses. Agile, that's the word.
Agile, creative. I think
all of those buzzwords. Yeah. We'll take them all.
As a last question to wrap this up, for our audience and, for us here in the Meet the Innovators session today, they often say that a crisis is a great opportunity in order to, grow. And you talked a little bit about how bio is eating the world, and, also that Europe is, has the potential to make great strides here. What do you think if you could share to investors, to the European legislative space, what would you like to share to them during this crisis period to enable entrepreneurs like yourselves to make progress and continue your great innovative journey?
Yeah, I think Europe is at a fundamental inflection point. I think we're seeing that now with the likes of Sequoia setting up shop in Europe with the round first minute capital just raised yesterday. I think we're starting to see the fruits of a lot of labor in the field, and I think healthcare in particular is a really exciting place to be in Europe for all the reasons I gave earlier. And I think the more capital the more competitive dynamics that investors have to face in Europe, the better it will suit families. The more we'll see entrepreneurs flourish, the more competitive dynamics there are between different investment groups in Europe. So I'd like to see more of the West Coast funds setting up hubs in Europe and building those links to try and traverse the Atlantic, which I think we are one of those companies doing that. And I oftentimes will share deal flow, but from my network in Europe with San Francisco-based investors to try and tighten those networks. But I think COVID will help that. I think the fact that we're all on Zoom, it doesn't really matter where you are. And hopefully more money will flow to Europe as a result, which will benefit young and up-and-coming companies.
Speaking of Zoom, thanks so much to everyone that's joined us. It's been great to have you guys here. Also great to have the attendees that are joining us later via the recording. We hope that EIT Health can answer the call to help companies like Ochre Bio continue to succeed. So thank you. And have
Thanks, Joey. Really nice talking to everyone. Thank you.
Bye, guys.